You can always tell who's never had to earn respect. They're the loudest ones asking for it. The mess hall was loud in the way only a naval base could be at 1,200 hours. Trays clattering, boots striking polished floors, a low storm of voices bouncing off steel and glass. And right in the middle of it all, I sat alone with a plastic fork and a plate that had gone cold 10 minutes ago, watching nothing, listening to everything. The way you learn to do when silence has kept you alive longer than noise ever could. And I remember thinking, just before it started, that every base has one man who mistakes volume for authority, confidence for experience, noise for strength, and you don't have to look for him. He finds you, like a storm rolling in whether you're ready or not. And sure enough, I heard him before I saw him. That sharp laugh cutting through the room, too clean, too practiced, followed by the scrape of a chair that didn't belong at my table. And then Boots stopped right beside me, not hesitant, not respectful, just planted like they owned the ground beneath them. "Hey," he said, voice carrying just enough edge to turn heads without raising it. "You lost, old man?" I didn't look up, just kept my eyes on the table, on the faint scratches worn into the surface from years of people passing through. Men who had come and gone, most forgotten before their boots cooled, and I could feel the shift around us. Conversations dipping just slightly, not stopping, but bending, like grass in the wind when something heavier moves through it. And that was when he pulled the chair across from me, slow, deliberate, making sure the legs screamed against the floor, announcing himself to anyone who hadn't noticed yet. "This section's for active personnel," he added, leaning forward just enough to cast a shadow across my tray. And I could smell the detergent on his uniform, fresh, sharp, untouched by time. "So either you're in the wrong place, or you forgot what you are." A couple of his buddies chuckled behind him, not loud, but eager, the kind of laughter that looks for permission before it exists. And I let the silence sit there between us, heavy, uncooperative. Because silence has a way of making men like him uncomfortable. It doesn't give them anything to push against, nothing to dominate. And sure enough, he shifted, just a little, tapping his fingers once on the table like he needed to fill the gap. "You hear me?" he said, a little sharper now. "I'm talking to you." And slowly, without any hurry, I set the fork down, the plastic clicking softly against the plate, a small sound in a loud room that somehow carried farther than it should have. And I lifted my eyes just enough to meet his, not challenging, not apologizing, just there, steady, and I saw it in that moment. The flicker, the brief hesitation he didn't expect, because men like him expect reactions, fear, anger, submission, but not stillness, never stillness, and it irritated him. I could see it tightening in his jaw. "All right," he said, leaning back now, louder so the table behind him could hear. "Let's make this simple." He gestured at me like I was part of the furniture, something out of place. "What was your rank?" And there it was, the question tossed out like a joke, like a test he already thought he'd passed, and I didn't answer. Not yet. Just let the noise of the room settle around us again. Trays sliding, someone calling for coffee, a door opening somewhere behind him. Because timing matters, it always has, and I could feel more eyes now, not just his friends, not just the nearby tables, but the room itself leaning in, curious, waiting, the way people do when they sense something about to shift, and he mistook that silence for weakness. I could see it, the way his shoulders squared, the confidence returning. "What? You don't remember?" One of them laughed. Maybe he never had one. Another added, and the first man smirked, satisfied, thinking he had already won something that hadn't even started yet. "Come on," he said, tapping the table again. "Say it." And I looked at him for a long second, long enough for the room to feel it, long enough for the noise to thin just a little more, and then I spoke, my voice low, steady, carrying just enough to reach him and no further. "You sure you want that answer?" He smiled when I said it, not because he understood, but because he thought he did, the kind of smile that comes from someone who believes the game is already over. "Oh, I am sure," he said, leaning back in his chair like he had all the time in the world, one arm draped over the backrest, claiming space that was never his to begin with, and the men behind him shifted closer, drawn in by the tone, by the promise of something entertaining, something easy, and I could feel the weight of their attention settle in, not heavy yet, but building, like pressure before a storm. And for a second I just watched him, really watched him, the clean lines of his uniform, the sharp edges of someone who had only ever operated in systems that worked, rules that held, a world where answers came fast and consequences came later if they came at all. And I thought about how many times I had seen that look before, different faces, different years, same certainty, same blind spot. And I let out a slow breath, not tired, not annoyed, just steady. All right, I said quietly, my voice low enough that he had to lean forward to catch it. And that was the moment the room leaned with him, not consciously, but it happened, the way sound bends people when something is about to be said, and I rested my hands on the table, palms flat, feeling the cool surface under my skin, grounding, familiar, and I could hear the small things now, the hum of the overhead lights, the distant clang of a tray dropping somewhere behind the serving line, a chair shifting 2 tables over, all of it clearer than it had been a minute ago, like the world had decided to narrow itself down to this one point, this one exchange. And then I spoke. I stopped using rank, I said, watching his eyes for the first flicker, the first crack, when they gave me a number. And for a second nothing happened, not immediately, because the meaning did not land all at once. It never does. It moves through people in layers, and his smile held, just barely, like it was waiting for the rest of the joke. A number, he repeated, glancing back at his friends, inviting them to laugh with him, but it did not come as quickly this time. One of them hesitated, just a fraction too long, and that was all it took for something to shift, subtle but real, and I saw it. From the corner of my eye before I heard it, a figure near the edge of the room going still, completely still, in a way that does not happen by accident. And then I heard the tray in his hands lower slowly onto the table without a sound, and a voice, older, rougher, not loud but carrying weight in a way volume never could, said, "Say that again." And the man across from me turned, irritation flashing first, because interruption meant loss of control, but that irritation did not last long, not. When he saw who had spoken, Chief Ramirez stood there, not rigid, not posturing, just present, but there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, something sharp and focused, like a memory had just been pulled into the light whether it wanted to be or not. And for the first time since he sat down, the young SEAL's confidence faltered, just a hairline fracture, barely visible, but enough. "Chief, we are just having a conversation," he said, trying to recover, trying to reframe it. But Ramirez did not look at him, not even once. His attention stayed on me, locked in a way that made the air feel thinner, tighter. "What number?" Ramirez asked, slower now, each word measured, like he already knew he was not going to like the answer, and I held his gaze, because now it mattered. Now it was no longer about the man in front of me, or the table, or the noise, or the room. It was about recognition, about whether the past was going to stay buried, or step forward into the light. And I could feel the room catching up, conversations dropping off one by one, the low hum fading, people turning in their seats, sensing something they could not yet name, and I gave the smallest nod, not for permission, not for approval, just acknowledgement, and then I said it, clear this time, no hesitation, no weight added, just the truth exactly as it had always been. 6, and it landed differently, not like a joke, not like a guess, but like a key turning in a lock somewhere deep in the room, and I watched it happen in real time. The way Ramirez's expression changed, not dramatically, not outwardly, but in the way his posture straightened just a fraction, the way his eyes sharpened, the way the space around him seemed to recalibrate. And he did not speak right away, because men like him understand the cost of words when they matter. And behind me, somewhere near the entrance, a door opened, and the sound cut through the silence that had finally, completely settled over the mess hall. The sound of that door did not belong to the room anymore. It cut through everything that had been building, clean and sharp, like a line drawn across the moment, and I did not turn to look at it. Not yet, because I had already seen what mattered, the way Chief Ramirez stood there with that stillness that only comes when memory overrides protocol. When something buried deeper than rank or routine rises up and refuses to be ignored. And across from me Logan Pierce felt it too, even if he did not understand it, his posture shifting, his confidence no longer sitting as comfortably on his shoulders as it had just seconds ago. 6, he repeated under his breath, like the word had changed shape between when he first heard it and now, like it had weight he had not accounted for. And one of the men behind him leaned in, quieter this time. What does that even mean? But nobody answered him, because the answer was already moving through the room in a different way, not spoken, not explained, just recognized by the ones who had been around long enough to know that some numbers were not numbers at all. They were names that no longer needed to be said out loud, and I could feel the shift ripple outward, table by table, voice by voice, conversations dissolving into fragments, then into silence, and the air itself seemed to tighten, like the room was holding its breath without realizing it. And then I heard footsteps, not rushed, not heavy, just deliberate, measured, the kind that do not need to announce themselves because everyone else does it for them. Chairs scraping lightly as people adjusted, not turning fully, but enough to see without being obvious, and still I did not look, because I did not need to. I had heard that walk before, years ago, in places where sound carried differently, where every step meant something, and I felt the presence stop just behind me, close enough that the space shifted, subtle but undeniable, and then a voice, calm, controlled, carrying without effort, "Chief," and Ramirez straightened fully now, not stiff, not exaggerated, just aligned, like something had snapped into place inside him. "Sir," he answered, and there was no confusion in it, no hesitation, just recognition, and that was when Logan stood up halfway, instinct more than decision, his chair scraping back louder than anything else in the room, drawing every eye that had not already turned. "Sir, we were just," he started, but the voice behind me did not respond to him, did not even acknowledge him, and that was the second shift, the one that lands harder than any words, when authority chooses where to look and where not to, and slowly, finally, I turned my head, just enough to see him, Rear Admiral Carter, older than the last time I had seen him, lines deeper, hair thinner, but the same eyes, steady, precise, the kind that measure before they move. And for a second, he did not say anything, just looked at me, really. Looked, not at the clothes, not at the years, but through them, past them, and I saw it happen. The recognition, not sudden, not dramatic, but certain, like confirming something he had already known before he walked in, and the room felt it, even if they did not understand it, because silence deepened, not awkward, not uncertain, but heavy, respectful without being told to be, and Logan was still standing there, caught between speaking and stopping, between explaining and stepping back, his confidence now fully replaced by something else, something quieter, less certain, and I turned back to the table, resting my hand near the edge, the same way I had before. Nothing changed on the surface, nothing needed to, and behind me the Admiral took one step closer, just one, enough to close the distance, enough to make it clear where the moment had shifted to, and when he spoke again, it was not loud, not commanding, just clear. "I was told there was a disturbance," he said, but his eyes never left mine, not even for a second, and Ramirez answered, "Situation is under control, sir." But the words carried something else now, something layered underneath, and the Admiral gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and then, without looking at anyone else in the room, without asking another question, he moved around the table and stopped across from me, right where Logan had been sitting just moments ago. And for the first time since this started, nobody moved, nobody spoke, because whatever this was, it was no longer a confrontation. It was something else entirely, something the room understood without needing it explained, and the Admiral's hand rested lightly on the back of the chair, not sitting yet, just there, and he said quietly, "It has been a long time." And in that moment, the mess hall was no longer a place of noise and routine. It was a space held together by silence, by memory, by something that did not need to be named to be felt. For a moment I did not answer him, not because I did not have anything to say, but because some words are not meant to be rushed. They settle into a space first. They test the air, and I could feel every eye in that room waiting, not for volume, not for explanation, but for meaning, and I let my gaze rest on the table again. The same scratches, the same worn surface, unchanged by rank or time. "Long enough," I said finally, my voice steady, carrying just enough to reach him and no further, and there was a quiet understanding in that exchange, something that did not need to be explained to anyone else, but everyone felt it anyway. The way the room stayed still, the way no one picked up a tray, no one shifted a chair, Even the usual background noise of a place like this seemed to hold itself back, like it knew better than to interrupt. And across from me the Admiral gave a slight nod. Not formal, not ceremonial, just acknowledgement, the kind earned over years that do not need to be listed. And then he did something that changed everything without a single command. He pulled the chair out slowly, the same chair Logan had dragged across the floor with careless confidence. But this time it made almost no sound at all, controlled, deliberate, and he sat down, not above me, not beside me, but across from me, placing himself into the same space that had just been used to challenge. And that shift landed harder than anything said so far, because authority does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply chooses where to sit, and in that moment the hierarchy in the room bent, quietly but completely, and I could feel it ripple outward. The men who had been standing straighter now, uncertain where to place their attention. The ones who had been watching now fully turned, no longer pretending not to be involved. And Logan Pierce stood there at the edge of it all, caught between instinct and understanding, his hands no longer relaxed at his sides, his posture no longer claiming space but searching for it. And for the first time since he had walked over, he did not speak, not because he had nothing to say, but because he did not know if he should, and that silence from him said more than anything he could have added. And the Admiral did not look at him, not yet, because this was not about correction, not in the way he expected. This was about recognition, and recognition does not rush. It settles, it confirms, it holds. And the Admiral leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table in a way that was almost casual, but nothing about it was casual. "We still run your extraction patterns," he said quietly, like he was continuing a conversation that had never actually ended. And I felt that line land, not just with me, but with the few in that room who understood enough to recognize what it meant, not the specifics, not the details, but the weight behind it. And I gave a small breath through my nose, not quite a laugh, not quite anything else, just acknowledgement of time, of distance, of the way things carry forward whether you intend them to or not. "You always adapted fast," I replied, and he allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile, the kind that does not show for long, the kind reserved for moments that are not meant for everyone. And behind him I could see Chief Ramirez still standing, still watching, but now his posture had shifted too, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but settled into something steadier, like a piece had fallen into place that he had not realized was missing. And the room began to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, not breaking the moment, but easing around it. And somewhere to my right a tray lifted, carefully, like the person holding it did not want to make a sound, and another chair shifted just slightly, controlled, respectful, and Logan finally moved, just a step back, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to remove himself from the center he had created. And I did not look at him, not because he did not matter, but because the lesson was not mine to deliver directly. It was already happening around him, in the silence, in the posture of the room, in the fact that no one laughed anymore, no one added a comment, no one needed to. And the Admiral straightened just a little, his hand resting briefly on the table as if grounding himself in the present before continuing. And when he spoke again, his voice carried just enough for those closest to hear. "Permission to sit with you," he said. And it was not a question in the way most people would understand it. It was respect, simple, direct, and I gave a small nod, because some things do not require more than that. And in that moment the mess hall, with all its noise and movement and routine, felt smaller, quieter, like it had shifted around. Something that did not need to prove itself to be understood. The chair settled beneath him without a sound, and for a few seconds neither of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the moment had already said enough for those who knew how to listen. And I could feel the room recalibrating around us, not loudly, not abruptly, but in small, controlled adjustments, trays lifted more carefully, voices lowered without being told, boots placed instead of dropped. And it was not discipline in the formal sense, not something enforced, it was something older, something that comes when people recognize they are standing near a line they do not fully understand but know better than to cross. And across from me Rear Admiral Carter rested his hands lightly on the table, fingers relaxed, posture steady, not performing authority, just existing in it. And I watched the way he glanced once, briefly, toward Logan Pierce, not with anger, not with correction, but with assessment, the kind that measures without announcing itself, and Logan felt it. I could see it in the way his shoulders tightened, in the way his eyes shifted for just a second before locking forward again, trying to hold ground that was already gone, and I remembered that feeling, not from him, but from others, from years when the world still divided itself cleanly between what you knew and what you did not, before you realized there were layers underneath everything. And I let my gaze drift past him for a moment, taking in the room, the faces that had turned back to their meals but were not really eating, the conversations that had resumed but carried a different tone now, quieter, more deliberate, like everyone understood something had just passed through without needing to name it. And the Admiral spoke again, softer this time. "We thought you were gone," he said, not as an accusation, not even as a question, just a statement laid gently into the space between us, and I let that sit for a second, feeling the weight of it, not heavy, just familiar. I answered, and that was enough, because the truth does not always need to be expanded, and he nodded once, slowly, accepting that answer the way you accept something that does not belong to you to question, and there was a pause again, not empty, just full in a different way, and then he leaned back slightly, just enough to shift the angle of the conversation. "They still talk about 6, he added, and that word, said differently now, not as a challenge, not as a guess, but as recognition, moved through the space with a clarity that did not need volume, and I could feel a few heads turn again, just slightly, just enough to catch it, and Logan's jaw tightened, not in defiance now, but in understanding that something had moved far beyond him, and I rested my hand lightly against the edge of the table, feeling the same worn surface, grounding, steady. "Stories tend to grow over time," I said, and the Admiral allowed a faint breath that might have been a quiet laugh. "Not that one," he replied, and there was no pride in it, no exaggeration, just fact, the kind that does not need to prove itself. And behind him Chief Ramirez shifted his weight once, a subtle movement, but it carried a decision, and he stepped forward just enough to stand within the edge of our space, not interrupting, not intruding, but present. "Sir," he said, directing it to the Admiral but glancing at me for a fraction of a second, "do you want the room cleared?" And that question hung there, not loud, but heavy with implication, because clearing a room is not just about space. It is about acknowledgement, about drawing a line between who belongs inside a moment and who does not. And the Admiral did not answer immediately, his eyes returning to mine, measuring, considering, and I gave the smallest shake of my head, not dismissive, just enough, and he understood. Of course he did. "No," he said calmly. "That will not be necessary." And Ramirez nodded once, stepping back into place without another word. And that decision settled over the room like a quiet confirmation. This was not something to be hidden, not something to be separated. It was something to be witnessed, even if not fully understood, and I could feel the tension ease just slightly, not disappearing, but shifting into something steadier, something grounded, and Logan finally exhaled, slow, controlled, like he had been holding it longer than he realized, and he took another step back, this time more deliberate, removing himself from the center completely, and for the first time since this started, he lowered his gaze, not in defeat, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge that whatever he thought he had been part of, he had not understood it at all, and I did not look at him, not directly, because some lessons are not given, they are realized, and the Admiral leaned forward again, resting his forearms on the table once more, the same quiet posture, the same controlled presence, and his voice dropped just slightly, meant only for me now. "Even if others could still hear it, there are people here who should know you are still around," he said, and I felt that line land differently, not as a request, not as a suggestion, but as an opening, and I considered it for a moment, not long, just enough, before giving a small, measured response. "Some things work better when they stay quiet," and he held my gaze for a second, then nodded once, because he understood that, too, perhaps better than most, and the room, still quiet, still aware, continued to move around us. But now it did so with a different kind of respect, not the kind that is demanded, but the kind that settles in when truth no longer needs to speak to be recognized. The words settled between us, and then moved past us, not spoken again but understood, and for a while neither of us needed to add anything. Because some conversations are not built on sentences, they are built on recognition, on the quiet acknowledgement of what has already been lived, and I could feel the room easing further, not back to what it had been before, but into something steadier, something more aware, like the space itself had adjusted its posture. And across from me, the Admiral remained exactly where he was, not rushing the moment, not forcing it forward, just letting it exist, and that told me more than anything he could have said, because men at his level do not waste time unless something is worth it. And he was still here, still sitting across from me at a table most people would not remember in an hour. And I let my eyes move again, slow, deliberate, taking in the edges of the room. The details people miss when they are too focused on themselves. A sailor near the far wall holding his cup, just a little tighter than before. Another man pretending to read something on his phone without actually looking at it. The kitchen staff moving quieter, more controlled, as if they had all agreed without speaking that this was not a moment to interrupt. And then my attention returned, not to the Admiral, but to the space just beyond him, where Logan Pierce still stood, no longer at the center, no longer commanding anything, just present, trying to understand where he now fit in a situation he had started, but no longer owned. And I could see the shift in him, not dramatic, not sudden, but real, the way his shoulders had lowered just slightly, the way his stance had narrowed, less about taking space and more about finding it. And for a brief second our eyes met again, not in challenge this time, not in resistance, just contact. And I saw it there, the beginning of understanding, not complete, not comfortable, but enough to change what came next. And I gave him the smallest nod, not approval, not dismissal, just acknowledgement, because sometimes that is all a man needs to recalibrate. And he responded the only way he could now, by stepping back another inch, creating distance without turning away, staying present, but no longer pushing. And that was enough. The moment did not need more from him. And I shifted my attention back to the Admiral, who had watched that entire exchange without appearing to, the kind of awareness that comes from years of reading rooms instead of reacting to them. And he spoke again, this time just a fraction louder, enough for the nearby tables to hear without turning it into a command. You taught a lot of people without ever standing in front of them, he said. And I let that sit for a second, because it was not entirely accurate. But it was not wrong either, and I answered simply, people learn when they are ready. And he gave a slight nod, accepting that as it was, and then his gaze shifted, just briefly, toward Logan, not calling him out, not correcting him directly, but including him in the space now, in a way that did not humiliate, did not diminish, but made something clear without saying it. And Logan straightened just a little, not back to where he had been, but enough to stand with intention, not ego, and that was the difference, subtle but important. And the Admiral leaned back slightly, his chair making the faintest sound against the floor, the first real sound he had made since sitting down, and it carried through the quiet room like a marker, a transition, not an ending, but a shift. And he placed one hand flat on the table for a moment, fingers spread, grounding himself the same way I had earlier. And then he spoke in a tone that carried just enough to settle the space fully. We do not get many chances to see where things started, he said, and I understood what he meant, not literally, but in the way experience loops back on itself, the way time folds in moments like this. And I allowed myself a small breath, steady, controlled. Most things do not start where people think they do, I replied, and that line moved through the air differently, not heavy, not sharp, just true. And the Admiral's expression shifted just slightly, the kind of change you only notice if you are looking for it. And he gave a final nod, slower this time, like something had settled for him as well. And then he pushed his chair back, standing in one smooth motion, not abrupt, not delayed, just precise. And as he did, the room responded again, not all at once, not loudly, but in that same controlled way, a few men straightening, a few others pausing mid-movement, acknowledging without being told. And he looked down at me for a brief second, not as a superior, not as a subordinate, just as one man to another, and said quietly, "It is good to know you are still out there." And I answered the only way that made sense. I never really left. And he held that for a second, then gave a final nod before turning, his presence moving away without taking the weight of the moment with it, leaving it behind, settled, understood. And as the door closed again somewhere in the distance, The mess hall did not return to what it had been before. It moved forward from where it now stood, quieter, steadier, and far more aware than it had been an hour ago. The door closed behind him, and the sound did not echo the way it normally would. It softened as if the room itself absorbed it, holding on to what had just passed through instead of letting it fade. And for a few seconds, everything stayed exactly as it was. Not frozen, not forced, just suspended in a kind of quiet awareness that does not happen often in places built on routine. And I remained where I was, hands resting lightly on the table, posture unchanged, because there was no need to move. Yet, the moment had not fully settled, not for everyone, and I could feel that in the space behind me, in the way the air still carried attention even as people tried to return to what they had been doing before, and then slowly, carefully, the room began to breathe again, not all at once, not loudly, but in pieces, a chair shifting here, a tray sliding there, a low voice resuming a conversation that did not quite pick up where it left off. And I reached for the fork again, the same one I had set down earlier, and lifted it just enough to rest it in my hand without actually eating, because hunger was not what had brought me here. And across the room I saw Chief Ramirez take a step back into his original position, but he did not fully disengage, his eyes still moving, still aware, tracking the room the way men like him always do. And then there was a movement to my left, measured, deliberate, not abrupt, and Logan Pierce stepped forward again. But this time it was different. Not the same approach, not the same energy. His steps were slower, more controlled, and when he reached the edge of the table he did not sit, did not reach for the chair. He just stood there for a second, like he was deciding whether he belonged in the space he had created earlier, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know, because men do not hesitate unless something inside them has shifted, and I kept my gaze on the table for a moment longer before looking up at him, giving him just enough acknowledgement to let him speak if he chose to. And he did, but not the way he had before, his voice lower now, stripped of the edge it carried earlier. "I did not know," he said, simple, direct, no excuses wrapped around it, no attempt to recover what had already passed, just the truth as he saw it now. And I watched him for a second, not judging, not correcting, just observing, because understanding does not need to be rushed either. And I gave a small nod, the same kind I had given him before. "You were not supposed to," I replied, and that landed differently for him. I could see it, the way his shoulders eased just a fraction, the way the tension in his stance shifted from defensive to reflective, and he exhaled once, slow, controlled, like he had been holding more than just breath. "I should not have said what I said," he added, and there was no audience for that now, no laughter behind him, no reinforcement, just him standing there in the space he had stepped into. And I considered that for a moment, not because I needed to, but because moments like this matter more than the ones that come before them. And I set the fork back down, letting it rest against the plate with a soft, almost inaudible sound. "You said what you understood," I told him. "Now you understand more." And that was enough. It did not need to be expanded, did not need to be turned into anything larger than it was. And he nodded once, accepting that, not fully resolved, not completely settled, but moving in the right direction. And he stepped back again, not retreating, just making space. And as he did, the room around us continued to shift, more naturally now. Conversations picking up again, but still quieter than before, more measured, as if something had been added to the air that would not leave when the moment did. And I picked up the fork again, this time actually taking a bite, not because I was hungry, but because the moment had passed enough to allow it. And across the room someone laughed, softly, not at anything in particular, just a normal sound returning, and the kitchen resumed its rhythm, plates moving, voices calling out orders. But even in that return there was a difference, a subtle change in tone, in pace, in awareness. And I sat there for another minute, finishing what was left on the plate, not rushed, not delayed, just steady. And when I finally stood, pushing the chair back with the same quiet control the Admiral had used earlier, the sound barely carried, and I picked up the tray, turning toward the return station like anyone else would, because that was the point. It always had been, to move through spaces without needing them to stop, to leave without needing to be followed. And as I walked past Logan, he stepped aside without thinking, not dramatically, not formally, just enough to clear the path. and that small movement said more than anything he had said out loud. And I gave him a brief glance, not lingering, just enough to acknowledge what had changed, and then I continued on, placing the tray down with a soft clink and heading toward the exit. The same door, the same path, nothing different on the surface, and yet the room behind me did not feel the same as when I had entered, not because I had changed it, but because moments like that leave something behind, something quiet, something that stays long after the noise returns. And as I reached the door and pushed it open, the light outside spilling in just enough to shift the tone of the space behind me. I did not look back, because I did not need to. The lesson had already settled where it needed to, and it would carry forward in ways none of them would fully notice until much later. The light outside was brighter than I expected, not harsh, just steady, the kind that makes everything look clearer without trying. And as the door eased shut behind me, the noise of the mess hall softened into a distant hum, still there, but no longer part of me, and I stepped onto the concrete walkway, feeling the subtle change under my boots, the shift from polished floor to something more worn, more honest, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the air settle, carrying the faint scent of fuel and salt, a mix that never really leaves a place like this no matter how many years pass. And I started walking without thinking about direction, because I already knew where I was going, even if I had not planned it, and the base moved around me the way it always does, purposeful, efficient, people crossing paths with intent, voices calling out in clipped tones, vehicles rolling past at a steady pace, nothing unusual, nothing out of place, and yet I could still feel the echo of what had just happened trailing behind me, not loud, not demanding attention, just present, like a shadow that does not need light to exist. And as I moved farther from the mess hall, the sound of it faded completely, replaced by the open space, the distant rhythm of the flight line, the low hum of engines warming somewhere out of sight, and I found myself slowing slightly as I approached the edge of a wide training field, the grass cut short, lines faintly visible from earlier drills, and I stopped. There, looking out across it without focusing on anything in particular, just taking in the space, the distance, the quiet that only exists in places built for noise. And for a moment, the present slipped just enough to let something older surface, not as a full memory, not as a replay, just fragments, the feel of a headset pressing against my ear, the crackle of a voice calling a number that meant more than a name ever could, the steady rhythm of breath measured against time, against distance, against things that did not allow mistakes. And then it passed, the way it always does, leaving behind nothing but a trace, and I let out a slow breath, not heavy, not relieved, just steady, grounding myself back where I was, because the past is not something you carry forward in full. It is something that moves with you in pieces, appearing when it needs to and leaving when it is done. And I shifted my weight slightly, turning to continue on, but before I took the first step I heard it, boots on concrete behind me, not rushed, not uncertain, just deliberate, and I did not need to turn to know who it was, because there was only one person on that base at that moment who would follow without hesitation and without announcement, and a second later he stopped just off to my side, not crowding the space, not trying to reclaim it, just present, and for a few seconds neither of us spoke, the silence between us no longer tense, no longer testing, just there. And then Logan's voice came, quieter than before, not unsure, but measured. "I have heard stories," he said, not looking directly at me yet, his gaze fixed somewhere out on the field, about 6. And there was no challenge in it now, no edge, just curiosity tempered by something else, something closer to respect. And I nodded slightly, not confirming, not denying, just acknowledging the weight of the word itself. And he took a breath, slow, controlled. "They never sounded real," he added, and I allowed the smallest shift in my expression, not quite a smile, not quite anything else, just enough to meet the moment. "Most things do not," I said, and that was the truth of it, not just for him, but for anyone who has ever stood on the outside of something they have not lived through. And he finally turned his head, looking at me directly now, not searching for answers, just holding the space. And I could see it clearly then. The change that had started back in the mess hall had settled into something more solid, not complete, not finished, but real. And he gave a single nod, the kind that does not ask for acknowledgement in return, And then he stepped back, not out of discomfort, not out of obligation, but because he understood where the line was now. And I returned the nod just as simply, because respect does not need to be spoken when it is already understood. And with that he turned, walking back toward the building we had just left, his steps steady, his posture different than before, less about taking space and more about carrying it. And I watched him go for a second, not long, just enough to see that the lesson had not been lost. And then I turned back toward the field, taking one step forward, then another, moving into the open space without looking back, because some moments are not meant to be revisited. They are meant to be carried forward, quietly, without announcement, the same way they arrived. The field stretched out in front of me, quiet in a way that only training grounds can be when no one is using them. The lines faint but still there, reminders of structure, of repetition, of lessons learned the hard way and carried forward by people who would never know where they started. And I walked across it without hurry, each step steady, measured, the same way it had always been, because pace is not about speed, it is about control. And the wind moved lightly across the grass, just enough to shift the surface without changing its shape. And I let my eyes drift across the horizon, not looking for anything, just observing. The way you learn to do when looking too hard means you miss what matters. And for a moment, everything felt exactly as it should, not because it was perfect, but because it was understood. And that is the difference most people never learn, the difference between control and awareness. And I stopped near the far edge of the field, where the ground met a narrow stretch of gravel that led toward the older part of the base, the part that most people passed by without noticing, buildings that had been repurposed, renamed, but never truly replaced. And I stood there for a second, letting the silence settle again. Not the same silence from the mess hall, not heavy, not focused, just open. And I reached into my jacket pocket without thinking, fingers brushing against something small, worn smooth over time, and I pulled it out, turning it between my fingers, a simple piece of metal, unmarked to anyone who did not know what to look for. But to me it carried more than anything that could be pinned or displayed, and I held it there for a second, not looking at it directly, just feeling its weight, the way it had always been there, even when it was not. And then I closed my hand around it again, slipping it back into my pocket, because some things are not meant to be shown, they are meant to be carried. And I exhaled slowly, steady, grounding myself in the present again, and I turned slightly, looking back across the field toward the buildings in the distance. And for a brief second I could almost see it, not clearly, not fully, just the outline of something that had once been, voices that were no longer there, movements that had long since faded. And then it was gone, leaving nothing but the space it had occupied, and that was enough. It always is. And I started walking again, following the gravel path without thinking about where it would lead, because I already knew, not the exact destination, but the direction, and that is all that ever really matters. And as I moved farther from the field, the base behind me continued its rhythm, unchanged on the surface. But I knew better. Moments like that do not disappear, they settle into places, into people, into the way things are done even when no one talks about them. And somewhere back there, in that mess hall, a young man would carry something forward, not a story, not a name, just a shift, a recalibration that would show up later in ways he would not immediately recognize. And that is how it works, not through announcements, not through recognition, but through quiet changes that build over time. And I kept walking, past the older buildings, past the areas where fewer people went, the noise of the active parts of the base fading behind me until it was nothing more than a distant presence. And the path narrowed slightly, leading toward a section that had been left mostly untouched, a place where time moved differently, slower, less concerned with the constant motion of everything else. And I stopped there for a final moment, looking out at nothing in particular, just the space, the quiet, the absence of expectation, and I let out a slow breath. Steady, controlled, the same way I always had. Because some habits do not fade. They become part of you in ways that do not need to be explained. And I adjusted my jacket slightly, a small movement, almost unconscious, and then I stepped forward again, continuing on without looking back, because there was nothing behind me that needed to be revisited. Everything that mattered had already moved forward. And as the path carried me farther away, the base, the field, the mess hall, all of it settled into the background, not forgotten, not lost, just where it belonged. Part of something larger, something quieter, something that does not need to be seen to exist, and the only thing that remained clear, steady, and unchanged was the simple truth that had carried through. All of it, through every moment, every silence, every shift, that respect is never taken, never demanded. It is recognized, often too late. But when it is, it does not need to be spoken to be understood.